My real name is Doctor Arlan Hayes. The name on my driver's license, on my mail, on the tombstone they've already prepared for me in some records office in Langley. That name is a fiction. It's a component of the life they gave me. This quiet, sterile existence they built around me to ensure my silence. But I'm 62 years old now. The silence has become a weight I can no longer bear. They don't know I'm making this tape. If they did, they wouldn't send men with guns. It would be quieter than that. A man my age has a heart attack, a tragic, unforeseen accident. They are very, very good at unforeseen accidents. I'm sitting in the basement of a house that isn't mine, 1,000 miles from any ocean. The only light is the small red recording lamp on this old machine. It glows in the dark like a single, watchful eye. And I'm making this because the pattern is starting again. I see it in the classifieds, in the coded messages disguised as shipping manifests. I hear it in the sudden, unexplained seismic reports from the upper Midwest. They're getting nervous. They're worried their tomb is no longer secure. And before they decide to permanently silence the last person who knows where it is, someone else needs to know the truth. Someone has to know what happened in the autumn of 1993 on the cold, clear waters of Lake Superior. It started, as these things so often do, with a lie. The official story was that the USNS Pathfinder, a stalwart-class ocean surveillance ship, was on loan to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for a joint deep-water geological survey. We were, ostensibly, mapping the deepest trenches of Lake Superior, studying sediment layers and tectonic fault lines. It was a plausible, even boring, cover. The press releases were dry, the mission statement was buried in academic jargon, and no one in the media paid us any mind. But the Pathfinder wasn't a NOAA vessel. It was Navy, and its heart wasn't a set of geological drills or sediment corers. Its heart was the Surveillance Towed Array Sensor System, the ANUQQ-2, or SURTAS, a listening device so sensitive that in the open ocean, it could track a Soviet submarine from 1,000 miles away by the specific sonic signature of its compromised propeller bearings. We weren't looking for rocks, we were ghost hunting. The Cold War was supposed to be over, a relic of a bygone era. But the skeletons of that war were very real. They were littered across the ocean floors of the world. And some, we believed, were littered at the bottom of the Great Lakes. The official intelligence, the whispers from the Pentagon, suggested that during the height of tensions in the 70s and 80s, the Soviets had used the St. Lawrence Seaway to sneak miniaturized, unmanned intelligence drones and other pieces of advanced, experimental hardware into the heart of the North American continent. The idea was to plant them near strategic sites, air bases, naval yards, command bunkers. Most were believed to be dormant, but the technology was a prize. My job, as the civilian lead on the sonar team, was to find them. I was the best. I could distinguish the sonar return of a half-buried 55-gallon drum from a World War II-era torpedo casing at 1,000 feet. I saw the world in sound, in the way pressure waves bounced off objects and painted a picture in my mind. I was a scientist, a man of data and hard fact. I believed there was nothing in the deep that could not be identified, cataloged, and explained. I was 31 years old. And I was a fool. The mission began like any other. The first 3 weeks were a study in excruciating boredom. We steamed back and forth across the western arm of the lake, from Duluth to the Apostle Islands, our towed array trailing a mile behind us, listening. The water was deep, over 1,000 feet in places, and cold. So cold it seemed to steal the warmth right out of the air. The autumn winds were sharp, and the sky was a hard, metallic gray that mirrored the water. On board, the mood was professional, but tense. We were a small crew. There was Commander Valeriev, the ship's captain, a career Navy man, third generation. He was hard, sharp-edged, and ran his ship by the book. He trusted his men and his vessel, but he had a deep, abiding suspicion of civilian specialists like myself. To him, I was an unpredictable variable, a brain on a stick who didn't understand the chain of command. Then there was Miller, a young sonar technician, second class. He was maybe 20, fresh out of A school, and his primary job was to watch the displays, drink coffee, and try not to get in the way. He was a good kid, but he had the wide, nervous eyes of someone who hadn't yet seen anything truly go wrong. And finally, there was the quiet man. Every Black Ops mission has one. He was introduced to us as Mr. Shaw, a logistical liaison from the Department of Defense. He wasn't Navy. He wasn't no AA. He wore civilian clothes that were just a little too neat, a little too bland. He rarely spoke, but he was always there, standing in the back of the control room, watching the screens, watching us. He had the kind of stillness that you only see in men who are professionally dangerous. Valeriev clearly disliked him, but gave him a wide berth. Shaw wasn't part of the ship's hierarchy. He represented the mission's true authority, the one we didn't talk about. For 21 days, we found nothing but geology, layers of silt, glacial debris, the occasional shipwreck from the turn of the century. We'd log them, Valeriev would make a note, and we would move on. The routine was hypnotic. The low hum of the ship's engines, the rhythmic ping of the active sonar, the endless green scroll of the waterfall display. Day after day of the same. It was on the morning of day 22 that the routine broke. The air in the sonar control room, or the main space as we called it, was thick with the familiar smells of stale coffee, warm electronics, and recycled air. It was a small, windowless room, crammed with racks of humming equipment and dominated by the massive sonar displays. I was sitting in the analyst's chair, my eyes tracing the familiar green lines as they cascaded down the screen, painting a picture of the lake bed 1,300 feet below us. Miller was at the primary console, his face illuminated by the glow. Commander Valeriev was standing behind me, arms crossed, radiating impatience. He hated this part of the mission, the waiting. He was a man of action, and we were, in his eyes, trawling. "Anything, Doctor?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, always on the edge of annoyance. "Just the abyssal plain, Commander," I replied, not taking my eyes off the screen. "More of the same. The sediment layer here is unusually thick. Glacial deposits, most likely. It's like looking at a blanket of... Wait." I stopped. My body went rigid. A new line had appeared on the display. It was faint at first, a ghost on the edge of the array's sensitivity. But it wasn't geology. Geology is messy, chaotic. It slopes, it crumbles, it erodes. This was a line. A perfectly straight, impossibly long line of hard, reflective material buried under several feet of silt. Miller, focus the passive array on that bearing. 090, I said, my voice suddenly tight. Miller's fingers flew across the console. The speakers in the room, which usually emitted a soft hiss of ambient water noise, crackled. A new sound emerged, a low, resonant hum. It was incredibly faint, barely there, but it was harmonically perfect. It wasn't the growl of a propeller, the whine of a turbine, or the thrum of an engine. It was a single, pure, unwavering tone. A sound that had no business being in nature. "What is that?" Valeriev asked, leaning in closer. The smell of his starchy collar filled the air. "I don't know," I whispered. "It's not mechanical. Not in any way I recognize. It sounds resonant, like a tuning fork the size of a building. And the object." I pointed to the screen. The ship was moving past it now, and the side-scan sonar was beginning to paint a more complete picture. It wasn't just a line. It was a shape, long, symmetrical, streamlined. "It's a hull," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. A big one. Buried. Valeriev's eyes narrowed. This was it. The ghost we were hunting. Soviet? He asked. Bring us about, helmsman. Slow to 1 knot. I want to get a full resolution pass. The ship began a slow, graceful turn. The tension in the room was suddenly electric. Miller was sweating, his eyes darting between his console and the commander. Even Mr. Shaw, who had been a silent statue in the corner, took a step forward, his gaze fixed on the main screen. The next 15 minutes were the longest of my life. The Pathfinder crept over the location, our sonar painting the object below, with thousands of focused sound pulses. The image resolved on the high-definition screen, and we all just stared. A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck the air out of the room. It was a submarine. There was no doubt. The shape was unmistakable. But it was all wrong. I had studied the sonar profiles of every known vessel on the planet, American and Soviet. I knew their silhouettes like the back of my hand. This was none of them. My God, Miller whispered. The size of it. He was right. Based on our preliminary measurements, it was over 700 feet long. A Soviet Typhoon class, the largest submarine ever built, was just under 600. This was significantly larger. But it wasn't just the size. It was the design. It was utterly, completely alien. There was no conning tower, no sail as we called it. The hull was a perfect, seamless teardrop shape. There were no visible dive planes, no rudder, no propeller. There was no discernible propulsion system at all. The hull itself, the sonar return was bizarre. Metal? Yes. Dense. But it was almost completely non-reflective to our active sonar. The sound waves seemed to just die when they hit it. It was like looking at a hole in the water, a submarine-shaped patch of silence. Valeriev was the first to speak, his voice strained. Dr. Hayes, your analysis? I swallowed. My mouth suddenly bone dry. I felt a cold dread creeping up my spine, a feeling that went against every rational, scientific instinct in my body. Commander, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. That is not a Soviet submarine. In fact, that is not a submarine of any known class or country. The design specifications do not exist. The materials, I can't explain the sonar absorption. It's like it's made of something designed specifically to defeat active sonar. A stealth coating decades ahead of anything we have, or anything we thought the Russians had. Mr. Shaw finally spoke, his voice soft but carrying an undeniable authority. How long do you estimate it's been down there, Doctor? I pointed to another screen, the one displaying the sub-bottom profiler data. It showed a cross-section of the sediment layers. This is the part I truly can't explain, I said. Look at the stratification. The object is resting on a layer of pre-Columbian bedrock. It's covered by approximately 400 years of undisturbed sediment. I paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. According to this data, this thing has been lying on the bottom of this lake since at least the mid-1700s, possibly earlier. The room fell into a profound silence, broken only by the steady, impossible hum coming from the speakers. A 700-foot, impossibly advanced submarine that had been resting at the bottom of Lake Superior for 4 centuries. The statement was not just a contradiction. It was an absurdity. It was a violation of the known universe. Valeriev stared at the screen, his face pale, his military certainty completely stripped away. He was looking at something that shouldn't exist. We all were. The mission to find Soviet technology was over. A new, far more terrifying mission had just begun. The initial shock in the sonar room slowly curdled into a thick, palpable tension. The impossible data on the screen wasn't a glitch. We ran diagnostics on every system, recalibrated the sensors, and made 3 more slow, painstaking passes over the target. Each pass confirmed the last. The size, the shape, the age, the impossible hum. It was real. Commander Valeriev, for the first time since I'd met him, seemed adrift. The world as he knew it, a world of clear enemies and established physics, had been upended. He retreated to his ready room with Mr. Shaw, and for the next hour, I could hear their low, urgent voices through the bulkhead. They were on the satellite phone, a secure channel to a number I was certain didn't connect to a public operator. They were talking to the people who had sent us here, the people who had believed they were hunting for Russian gadgets. I could only imagine the disbelief on the other end of that line. While they talked, I stayed in the sonar room with Miller. The kid was visibly shaken. He kept wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers and staring at the frozen image of the anomaly on the main screen. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "How can it be that old? I mean, steam engines weren't even a thing then. What could... He couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't have an answer for him. My own mind was a whirlwind of frantic, failing logic, a sunken vessel from an unknown, ancient civilization, a trans-dimensional object that had phased into our reality, an extraterrestrial craft that had crashed here centuries ago. Every possibility was more insane than the last. I tried to ground myself in my own discipline. "Forget the age for a moment, Miller," I said, my voice more confident than I felt. "Just focus on the data. What is the hull telling us?" We spent the next hour analyzing every pixel of the sonar return. The most baffling aspect was the utter seamlessness of its construction. "There are no weld lines," I murmured, tracing the outline on the screen with my finger. "None. A modern submarine hull is made of hundreds of massive, curved steel plates welded together. The seams are a major structural weak point. This thing, it's either forged from a single, colossal piece of metal, or it's been assembled by a method we can't even comprehend. It's like it was grown, not built." The hum was the other enigma. It hadn't changed. A single low-frequency note that seemed to vibrate in my teeth, even through the hull of our own ship. It didn't sound like a power source. It sounded like a state of being, like the object was resonating with something. Finally, Valeriev and Shaw returned. The commander's face was a grim mask. He had his orders. The indecision was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Dr. Hayes," he began, his voice flat. "We have new directives. Mission Sturgeon is now in effect. Full communications blackout. No transmissions of any kind without my direct authorization. Our objective has changed. We are no longer conducting a search. We are conducting a close-up examination." He turned to Miller. "Son, prepare the Deep Sea for deployment." The Deep Sea was our remotely operated vehicle, our ROV. It was a small, powerful submersible about the size of a large filing cabinet, equipped with high-intensity lights, thrusters, a manipulator arm, and a broadcast-quality video camera. It was our eyes and ears in the deep. "We're going down there?" Miller stammered. "Yes, son," Valeriev said, his gaze unwavering. "We are." The preparation took 2 hours. The deck crew worked under the harsh glare of the ship's lights, hoisting the yellow ROV from its cradle and positioning it over the stern A-frame. The wind had picked up, and the lake, which had been calm, was beginning to show a dark, choppy surface. The sky was turning a bruised purple as dusk approached. I stood on the deck watching them, the cold wind cutting through my jacket. I felt a profound sense of foreboding. We were a tiny, fragile bubble of light and warmth on an immense black sea, and we were about to poke a stick at something that had slept in the dark for longer than my country had existed. Down in the control van, a converted shipping container packed with electronics, the atmosphere was clinical. I was at the main observation monitor. Valeriev stood behind me, and Miller was at the controls, his hands flying over the joystick and thruster controls with a practiced ease that belied his nervousness. Mr. Shaw stood in the back corner, A silent, ominous sentinel. "Arov is in the water," the deck chief's voice crackled over the intercom. On my screen, the view shifted from the gray deck to a bubbling, churning green, and then, as the ROV descended, to a deep, dark blue. The powerful lights of the drone cut a cone of visibility into the gloom. "Depth, 100 feet, Miller reported, his voice tight. "All systems green." The descent was hypnotic. The water grew darker, from blue to indigo, to a pure, featureless black. The only things visible in our lights were particles of lake snow, bits of organic detritus drifting lazily in the water column like stars in a dead galaxy. 500 feet. 800 feet. 1,000 feet. We are approaching the lake bed. The hum from the anomaly was getting louder on our hydrophones, bleeding into the audio feed from the ROV. It was a physical presence now, a vibration that you could feel in the floor of the control van. "I have visual on the bottom," Miller said. The sandy, silt-covered floor of Lake Superior appeared in our lights. The ROV leveled off, hovering about 20 feet above the bottom. "Okay, Miller," I said, my heart pounding. "Easy does it. Bring us forward on the target's last known bearing." The ROV crept forward through the blackness. For a minute we saw nothing but endless, barren silt. And then something loomed out of the darkness. It was the hull. My breath caught in my throat. The sonar images had not done it justice. They were sterile, two-dimensional representations. This was real. It was a wall of absolute black metal rising from the lakebed, disappearing into the oppressive darkness above and beyond the reach of our lights. It was so black it seemed to drink the light from our powerful lamps. There was no reflection, no glint of metal, just a flat, matte, light-devouring surface. It wasn't a machine. It was a monument. "My God," Valeriyev breathed from behind me. "Bring us closer, Miller. Slowly." The ROV edged forward until it was only a few feet from the hull. The camera panned along its surface. Seamless. Utterly, perfectly seamless. It was like looking at the side of a polished obsidian mountain. And then we saw them. The markings. They weren't welds or panels. They were etched into the hull itself. Shallow, but perfectly clear. They weren't letters from any alphabet I knew. Not Russian, not English, not anything. They were runes. Complex geometric symbols arranged in strange, repeating patterns. They looked ancient. More ancient than 400 years. They looked as if they belonged on a megalithic tomb, not a submarine. "What are those?" Valeriyev asked. "Are they a language?" "I don't know," I said, my mind racing. "They don't match any known runic system. Not Norse, not Germanic. This is something else entirely." While we were focused on the runes, I had another team member back on the ship running a quick analysis of the sediment samples our ROV had automatically collected on its way down. My headset crackled. It was Peterson, the geologist. "Arlan, you there?" "I'm here, Pete. What have you got?" His voice was strained, confused. "The sediment layers are just like you predicted from the sonar. The object is resting on a stratum that's, well, it's old. Very old. But that's not the weird part. The metal content in the immediate vicinity of the hull it's off the charts. We're seeing isotopic ratios of certain heavy metals that have no business being on this planet. They don't match any known terrestrial or meteoritic source. I don't know what this thing is made of, Arlan, but it wasn't mined on Earth." Before I could even process the terrifying implication of his words, a new sound came over the audio feed. A change in the hum. It was no longer a steady, single note. It began to fluctuate, to pulse. The frequency was rising. "What's happening?" Miller shouted, his hands white on the controls. On the screen, the runes, which had been just faint etchings, began to change. A soft, Internal light was building within them, a pale, sickly blue glow. "It's reacting to us," I said, a wave of pure, primal fear washing over me. "It knows we're here." "Pull back!" Valeriev yelled. "Miller, get the ROV away from it now!" But it was too late. The hum rose to a deafening shriek. The blue light from the runes flashed with an impossible intensity, flooding our camera with pure, white light. And then, a sound. Not a shriek, but a single, deep, resonant thump, like the ringing of a colossal bell. In the control van, the lights flickered once, twice, and died. Every screen went black. The hum of the electronics, the ventilation, everything vanished. We were plunged into absolute darkness and a terrifying, profound silence. We were dead in the water. The silence that followed was deeper and more absolute than any I have ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of everything. The familiar, life-affirming hum of the ship's generators, the whir of ventilation fans, the quiet crackle of electronics. All of it was gone, snatched away in an instant. We were adrift in a metal box, plunged into a darkness so complete it felt physical, like being wrapped in black velvet. The only sound was the frantic, ragged breathing of the 4 men in the control van. A full second passed, then 2. It felt like an eternity. What happened? Miller's voice was a high, panicked squeak in the dark. "Report!" Valeriev's voice boomed, regaining a sliver of his command authority, but I could hear the tremor in it. "Emergency lighting. Now." I fumbled in the darkness, my hands searching for the manual latch on the emergency lighting panel. My fingers felt clumsy, disconnected from my brain. I found the latch, flipped it, and a single, grim, red emergency bulb flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows across the small room. The scene it illuminated was one of controlled chaos. Miller was slumped in his chair, his face ghostly pale. Valeriev was standing ramrod straight, but his eyes were wide with a fear he couldn't quite conceal. And Mr. Shaw hadn't moved. He was still in the corner, and in the hellish red light his face was a blank, unreadable mask. But his eyes were sharp, analytical. He wasn't scared. He was observing. He was assessing the new situation. "It was an EMP," I said, my voice hoarse. "An electromagnetic pulse, but not like any I've ever read about. Nuclear EMPs are high-altitude broadband events. This was localized, surgical. It felt like it was directed right at us." "The source?" Valeriev asked, though he already knew the answer. I pointed to the dead black screens. "The object, the submarine. It hit us with a pulse. It's disabled us." Valeriev grabbed the intercom handset. "Bridge, engine room, damage control, report!" He clicked the button again and again. Nothing. The intercom was as dead as everything else. He threw the handset down in disgust. "The entire ship is down. We've lost propulsion, navigation, communication, everything. We were a ghost ship, adrift on the black water, miles from shore, with no way to move and no way to call for help." The realization sank into the room like a physical weight. We were completely and utterly alone, stranded directly above an unknown, ancient, and clearly hostile entity. The psychological pressure began to mount almost immediately. The silence was the worst part. Without the familiar thrum of the engines, every tiny sound was magnified. The creak of the ship's hull as it shifted on the waves, the groan of stressed metal, the whisper of the wind outside. The ship, once a powerful instrument of modern technology, now felt like a coffin. An old, creaking, vulnerable coffin. Valeriev, falling back on his training, tried to impose order. "Okay," he said, his voice a low growl. "Panic is not an option. We follow procedure. Mr. Miller, stay here. Monitor the silence. Dr. Hayes with me. We're going to do a manual systems check. Shaw, you?" He trailed off, looking at the quiet man. "I'll accompany you, Commander," Shaw said smoothly. "My department will want a full report on the nature of the system's failure." His tone was calm, but the implication was clear. He was no longer just an observer. He was now a co-authority in a crisis situation. The three of us left the suffocating confines of the control van and stepped out onto the main deck. The change was jarring. The wind was colder now, whipping across the deck with a mournful howl. The sky was a starless, inky black. The only light was the faint, ghostly glow of the emergency battle lanterns, casting a weak, yellowish circle on the wet steel. The rest of the ship was a dark, hulking silhouette. We made our way through the dead vessel, our footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silent corridors. It was a deeply unsettling experience. This ship, which had been a hive of activity just an hour before, was now a tomb. We checked the bridge first. The array of screens and indicators was dark. The GPS, the radar, the depth sounder, all dead. The ship's chronometer was frozen at the exact moment of the pulse. In the engine room, it was the same story. The massive diesel generators were silent. The chief engineer and his team were working by flashlight, their faces smudged with grease and frustration. "It's no good, Commander," the chief said, wiping his hands on a rag. "The pulse fried the electronic ignition systems. The governors are shot. The digital control boards are completely melted. I can probably get one of the emergency backup generators running, but it's going to take hours, maybe days, of rewiring it by hand. And even then, it'll only be enough to power the emergency lights and maybe the galley. No propulsion, no main comms." The news was a hammer blow. We weren't getting out of here on our own. Our only hope was that someone, somewhere, would eventually notice that a U.S. Navy vessel had gone silent and fallen off the map. But this was a black operation. We were officially a no-AA research vessel. How long would it take for anyone to realize something was wrong? A day? A week? As we stood in the gloomy, silent engine room, a new sound began. It was faint at first, barely perceptible over the howling of the wind, a low, rhythmic creaking. "What is that?" I asked. The chief engineer looked up, his face etched with worry. "It's the anchor chain, sir. We're not just adrift. We're dragging anchor." The implication was terrifying. The wind was pushing us, and we were slowly, inexorably, being dragged across the surface of the lake, right over the spot where the anomaly lay. We were a toy, being pulled on a string. We returned to the deck, the sense of dread now a cold, hard knot in my stomach. Valeriev stared out into the blackness, his jaw tight. "So we wait," he said, more to himself than to us. "We wait for someone to come looking for us?" Shaw stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the dark water. "They will come, Commander," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The question is, what will happen before they get here?" And as if in answer to his question, a new phenomenon began. A soft, pale light began to emanate from the water off the port side. It wasn't from a searchlight or another vessel. It was coming from below, from the depths, a diffuse, pulsing blue-green glow that illuminated the churning surface of the lake from beneath. We all stared at it, mesmerized and horrified. The light was beautiful, ethereal, and utterly terrifying. It was the color of the glowing runes on the hull. The thing below us was no longer just humming. It was awake, and it was shining a spotlight on us, letting us know that it saw us. We were trapped in its cage, and now it was turning on the lights to get a better look at its new pets. The night that followed was the longest of my life, a slow descent into psychological horror. That eerie, pulsing blue light from the depths became our entire world. It painted the underside of the low-hanging clouds, creating a false, sickly twilight. It reflected off the steel hull of the Pathfinder, making our dead ship look like a ghost vessel floating on a sea of pale fire. The light was not constant. It would pulse in slow, rhythmic waves like a massive, sleeping heart. Sometimes it would dim, plunging us back into near total darkness, and our own hearts would pound in our chests, waiting for what would come next. Then, it would surge back, brighter than before, bathing the entire ship in its cold, alien glow. Sleep was impossible. Every man on board was on edge, his nerves stretched to the breaking point. The crew huddled in the mess hall, the only space large enough for all of us, lit by a few battery-powered lanterns. They spoke in hushed, fearful whispers. Wild theories began to circulate. It was a secret Soviet weapon. It was a volcanic vent. It was something else. No one dared to say the word alien, but it hung in the air, unspoken and terrifying. Commander Valeriev tried to maintain a facade of control, but the strain was beginning to show. He paced the bridge, his face a grim, haggard mask in the red glow of the emergency lights. He was a man without a ship to command, a captain with no control over his vessel's fate, and the helplessness was eating him alive. Mr. Shaw, however, remained unnervingly calm. He moved through the ship like a phantom, observing the crew, listening to their conversations, his expression a constant, unnerving blank. He seemed less like a man trapped in a crisis and more like a scientist observing rats in a maze, taking meticulous mental notes on our reactions to the stimulus. The entity, for that is what I began to call it in my own mind, began its true assault around 3 a.m. It started with sound, not the steady hum from before, but something far more insidious. Faint, complex sounds began to bleed through the hull. At first, they were indistinct, like distant music or garbled voices carried on the wind. But as the hours wore on, they became clearer, more defined, and they were different for everyone. I was on the bridge with Valeriev when it started for me. I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. It was the faint, unmistakable sound of a child crying. It sounded exactly like my daughter, who was 6 years old at the time, safe at home 1,000 miles away. The sound was impossible, but it was there, a phantom echo in the silence between the creaks of the hull. I saw Valeriev flinch. "Did you hear that?" He whispered, his eyes wide. "Hear what?" I asked, my own heart hammering against my ribs. It sounded like a naval battle. Cannon fire, shouting in Russian. We were both hearing things tailored to us. I looked over at Miller, who had come up to the bridge for a coffee he couldn't have. He was clutching his head, his face contorted in agony. "Make it stop," he whimpered. "The buzzing. It's inside my head." A high-pitched squeal, like feedback. The entity wasn't just making noise. It was projecting. It was digging into our minds, finding our fears, our memories, and playing them back to us. It was a form of psychological warfare, so advanced, so personal, it was devastating. The physical phenomena started an hour later. It began with the ship's compasses. The old analog magnetic compasses on the bridge, which had been pointing steadily north, began to spin wildly, rotating in lazy, impossible circles. Then, small, unsecured metal objects around the ship began to vibrate. A wrench left on a workbench in the machine shop rattled against the steel. A set of keys on a hook in the galley began to jingle in unison with the pulsing light from below. Then came the moment of direct, undeniable contact. I was standing near the stern, looking down at the glowing water, trying to force my scientific mind to find a rational explanation. Bioluminescence, a natural gas vent, anything. As I stared, a new shape formed in the pulsing light. It was the shadow of the ROV, still connected to us by its now dead umbilical cable, dangling limply 1,000 feet below. As I watched, the ROV began to move, not randomly, but with purpose. Its manipulator arm, which should have been locked in place, extended slowly. The claw at the end opened and closed, like a hand waving. It then began to bang the claw against the side of the anomaly's hull, down in the crushing dark. Bang. Pause. Bang. Bang. Pause. Bang. It was a code, a simple, repeating pattern. My blood ran cold as I recognized it. It was the first few bars of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," the same nursery rhyme I sang to my daughter every night before bed. The thing below us wasn't just in our heads anymore. It was demonstrating its control over our own technology. It was communicating with me, using my own machine, my own intimate memories, as a puppet. It was a display of power so profound, so mocking, it shattered the last vestiges of my disbelief. I stumbled back from the railing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran into Mr. Shaw, who was standing in the shadows of the deckhouse watching me. "It's toying with us," I choked out. "It's playing with us." Shaw's expression didn't change. He simply tilted his head, a glint of cold, academic curiosity in his eyes. "Fascinating," he said, his voice a low whisper. "The psychological impact is even more potent than the initial report suggested." My mind reeled. Initial reports? What initial reports? Who else knows about this? Shaw gave me a small, chilling smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Doctor," he said, "you didn't really think you were the first, did you?" The implication of his words was more terrifying than the nursery rhyme. We weren't discoverers. We were just the latest in a line of doomed expeditions. We were another data point in an ongoing secret experiment. And the entity below us wasn't the only monster we were dealing with. There was one on the ship with us. The final image we ever received from the deep-sea ROV became the central artifact of Incident Sturgeon. It was the last gasp of a dying machine, a single, corrupted frame of data that was burned into my memory, and later, into the pages of a report so secret its existence is still denied. After the entity used our ROV to taunt me, the video feed, which we had presumed to be completely dead, flickered to life for less than a second. It was just long enough for the system's buffer to capture one frame. It wasn't a clear image. It was a mess of digital noise, static, and distorted color banding. A hallmark of a signal being overwhelmed by a massive energy field. But through the noise, you could see it. The camera was pointed directly at one of the large geometric runes on the submarine's hull. The same rune that had been glowing with a faint blue light before the EMP. But now, it was no longer blue. It was blazing with an intense, fiery, crimson light. It pulsed with a malevolent inner fire, like a hot coal. It was no longer just on. It was active. It was enraged. And the most chilling detail, the one that the analysts at Fort Meade would later spend thousands of hours debating, was that the very shape of the rune had subtly changed. The lines were sharper, more aggressive. New, smaller, hair-like sigils had appeared around its periphery. It was as if our presence, our attempt to study it, had triggered a metamorphosis. We weren't just observing it anymore. We had fundamentally altered it. Or more accurately, we had awakened it. That single, terrifying image became the focal point of our desperate, stranded existence. Valeriev had it printed out on the last of the battery-powered printer's energy, and he, Shaw, and I stared at it for hours in the dim light of his ready room. It was our Rosetta Stone, a key to a language we couldn't comprehend, a warning we couldn't decipher. "It's a threat display," I remember saying, my voice thin. "In the animal kingdom, bright colors, sudden changes in pattern. It's a warning. I am dangerous. Stay away." "Or it's a beacon," Shaw countered, his voice as placid as ever. He tapped the glowing rune on the paper. A signal. Now that it's awake, it could be calling something. Or it's simply a state change. A shift from dormant to active, like a nuclear reactor going from subcritical to critical. Valeriev, ever the military man, saw it differently. "It's a weapon system coming online," he growled. "That thing is charging, and we are sitting right on top of it." His words hung in the cold air. The psychological games, the auditory hallucinations, the vibrating tools, that was the prelude. The glowing red rune was the main event. We all felt it. The ship was no longer just a prison. It was ground zero. The waiting was the true torture. Every creak of the hull, every whisper of the wind, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through our exhausted bodies. The men were on the edge of mutiny. Not a violent one, but one born of sheer terror. A few of them, led by a burly boatswain's mate, had begun to lash together makeshift rafts from empty fuel drums and wooden pallets. Their logic was simple and primal. They would rather take their chances on the freezing open water of Lake Superior than wait for the thing below to finish whatever it was doing. Valeriev had to physically stand in their way, his service pistol drawn to stop them. Not to be a tyrant, but because he knew it was a death sentence. The exposure would kill them in under an hour. His authority, once absolute, was now hanging by a thread. He was just one desperate man trying to hold back a tide of pure animal fear. Miller, the young sonar tech, had completely broken. He was found huddled in a storage closet, wrapped in old canvas sails, rocking back and forth and humming a single monotonous note to himself, the same frequency as the original hum from the anomaly. He was trying to match it, to placate it. He was a human tuning fork, and the sound was a prayer to a dark god. We had to sedate him. My own sanity was fraying. The phantom sound of my daughter's crying had become a constant companion, a faint, heartbreaking whimper at the edge of my hearing. I found myself talking to it, whispering reassurances into the empty, cold air. I was a man of science, a creature of logic, and I was losing my mind. I retreated to the dead sonar room, my sanctum. I plastered the walls with every scrap of data we had, the sonar maps, the geological reports, the single, terrifying image of the rune. I was looking for a pattern, a key, anything that would give us leverage. I was convinced that if I could just understand the rules of this entity, we could survive. It was on the third day of our isolation, as a sliver of gray dawn broke over the horizon, that the situation escalated from psychological terror to physical violence. It happened without warning. The ship was suddenly rocked by a massive jolt, as if we had run aground even though we were in over 1,000 feet of water. A deep, grinding, metallic screech echoed through the hull, a sound of immense pressure and tearing steel. Men were thrown from their bunks. Equipment crashed to the floor. The ship listed heavily to port, the deck tilting at a sickening angle. We all scrambled onto the main deck, clinging to railings for support. The pulsing blue light in the water was gone. The water itself was churning, boiling, as if something of unimaginable size was moving directly beneath us. And then, it broke the surface. It wasn't the submarine itself. It was a tendril. A thick, black, glistening appendage that rose from the water about 50 yards from our ship. It was at least 10 feet thick, and it rose higher and higher, 50, 60, 100 feet into the air. It wasn't solid. It seemed to be made of a swirling, semi-liquid material, a mass of cohesive black fluid that held its shape against gravity. It swayed in the morning air, and then it turned toward us. It was like a tentacle, but it had no suckers, no features. It was just a pillar of impossible living darkness. A collective scream went up from the crew. Men fell to their knees, weeping and praying. This was no longer a mystery or a phenomenon. This was a monster. A monster from the blackest depths of the lake, from the darkest nightmares of humanity. Valeriev, his face ashen, screamed into his handheld radio, a device that was only useful for ship-wide communication. "All hands, brace for impact." The tendril struck the Pathfinder amidships. The sound was not a crash, but a sickening, wet thump. The entire vessel groaned in protest, the steel plates of the hull screaming as they were bent inward. The ship was lifted partially out of the water, then slammed back down. Men were thrown across the deck like dolls. I saw one sailor, a kid from Ohio, lose his grip on a railing and slide across the tilted deck, over the side, and into the churning water without a sound. He was gone. The tendril retracted, sliding back beneath the waves as silently as it had appeared. The ship, crippled and groaning, settled back into the water, now listing at a terrifying 20-degree angle. Water was pouring in through the gash in the hull. The emergency pumps, which we had painstakingly rewired, were overwhelmed in minutes. We were sinking. The ship had maybe an hour, 2 at most, before it would founder and plunge to the bottom, taking us all with it. The end had come. There was no more waiting, no more analysis. There was only the cold, black water and the certainty of a terrifying death. And it was in that moment of absolute despair, as the ship slowly died beneath my feet, that a new sound cut through the air. It was the rhythmic thumping of rotor blades, a sound from a different world, a world of order and technology, a sound of rescue. Over the gray horizon, 2 helicopters appeared. They were sleek, black, and utterly unmarked. They weren't Coast Guard. They weren't Navy search and rescue. They were the kind of helicopters you only see in hushed tone intelligence briefings. They were the cleanup crew. Our rescue was not a rescue. It was an extraction and a cover-up. The choppers didn't land. They hovered over our sinking ship and ropes were dropped. Men in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by helmets and visors, rappelled down onto our deck with a terrifying efficiency. They weren't here to offer comfort. They moved with brutal purpose, their weapons held at the ready. They weren't looking at the water, at the source of our terror. They were looking at us. We were the primary threat. We were the evidence that needed to be contained. Their leader, a man with no name and no rank insignia, approached Valeriev. "Commander," he said, his voice amplified and distorted by his helmet, "my team is assuming control of this vessel and its crew. You will order your men to cooperate fully. You will surrender all logs, all data, all recordings. Is that understood?" Valeriev, a proud man, a captain of a U.S. Navy vessel, looked at the gash in his ship, at the faces of his terrified crew, at the unmarked soldier who had just superseded his command. He nodded. A broken man. "It's understood," he said, his voice a dead whisper. We were herded like cattle towards the ropes. No one spoke. The shame and the terror were a thick blanket over all of us. As I was being hooked onto the harness, I took one last look at the water. The churning had stopped. The surface was calm again. The monster had retreated. It had done its job. It had broken us. Mr. Shaw was the last to be evacuated. He stood calmly on the tilting deck of the sinking Pathfinder, having a quiet, final conversation with the black-clad team leader. He handed over a small, hardened briefcase. His part of the mission was complete. He had delivered the rats to the new, more secure laboratory. As our helicopter lifted off, banking sharply away from the scene, I watched the USNS Pathfinder, my home for the last month, slip beneath the waves. It went down silently, with a final gurgling sigh, leaving nothing behind but a patch of debris and a secret that was now more secure than ever, buried under 2,000 feet of water and a mountain of government denial. The mystery was not solved. It was simply classified. The flight was silent and grim. We were packed into the back of the helicopter, shoulder to shoulder, a collection of stunned, shivering men. The tactical team that had rescued us treated us not as fellow servicemen, but as contaminated material. They didn't speak to us, didn't look at us. They were walls of black gear and cold indifference. We were flown not to Duluth, not to any recognizable naval base, but to a small, isolated airfield I didn't recognize. From there, we were put onto a windowless transport plane. The flight lasted for hours. We had no idea where we were going. When we finally landed, the air that hit us as we deplaned was dry and hot. Desert air. We were a long, long way from the cold waters of Lake Superior. The facility they took us to was not on any map. It was a cluster of low, windowless concrete buildings in the middle of a vast, empty expanse of sand and rock, surrounded by concentric rings of razor wire fences and watchtowers. It had the grim, anonymous feel of a place designed for making people disappear. This was where the debriefing, the indoctrination, would take place. They separated us. I never saw Commander Valeriev or most of the crew again. I assume they were given the same deal I was, scattered to the winds with new names and new lives, forever looking over their shoulders. I was taken to a small, bare room. It contained a metal table and 2 chairs. The walls were a pale, institutional green, the kind of color designed to be calming, but which only inspires a deep, bureaucratic dread. After an hour of sitting in silence, 2 men entered. They were the platonic ideal of men in black. They wore identical, perfectly tailored dark suits, white shirts, and dark ties. They could have been twins, both with the same bland, forgettable faces and cold, empty eyes. They didn't introduce themselves. They sat down opposite me. One placed a thick file folder on the table between us. The other placed a small, high-quality audio recorder next to it. Doctor Arlan Hayes, the first one said. His voice was a monotone, devoid of any inflection. "We are here to help you understand what you experienced and what you will do now." For the next 6 hours, they interrogated me. It wasn't a hostile interrogation. It was worse. It was a surgical dissection of my memory. They had me recount every detail of the incident, from the first sonar contact to the final moments on the sinking Pathfinder. They were particularly interested in the runes, the hum, the EMP, and the psychological effects. I described the sounds, the visions, the nursery rhyme. They listened impassively, taking meticulous notes. They never once showed surprise or disbelief. They were not learning about this for the first time. They were corroborating. They were comparing my testimony to a pre-existing file, the file that Shaw had mentioned. When I was finished, exhausted and emotionally drained, the second man spoke for the first time. "What you encountered," he said, his voice as flat as his partner's, "is designated a permanent national security hazard. The location of the anomaly is now a restricted zone, coded Sturgeon's Rest. All satellite imagery of the area will be scrubbed. All maritime traffic will be permanently rerouted under the guise of environmental protection. The official report will state that the USNS Pathfinder was lost in a sudden, unseasonable storm with all hands on board. A tragedy." I stared at him, my blood running cold. "All hands, but we're alive." The first man gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. "As of today, the men who served on that ship are deceased. Their families will be notified. They will receive full honors and benefits. The men who sit in this facility are something else. They are assets in a state of indefinite quarantine." "Quarantine?" I stammered. "You think we're contaminated?" "Not physically, Doctor," the second man said. "Mentally. You have been exposed to a mimetic cognito hazard, an informational virus, The knowledge of the anomaly is the contagion. It cannot be allowed to spread. Therefore, you will be given a choice. He opened the thick file on the table. It was filled with documents, a new birth certificate, a new social security number, a new educational history from a university I'd never attended, a complete fabricated life. You can accept this new identity, the first man continued. You will be relocated, given a generous pension. You will live a quiet life. You will never speak of Lake Superior, the Pathfinder, or the Sturgeon anomaly to anyone, ever. You will sign a national security oath so binding that a violation will be considered an act of high treason, punishable by measures you do not wish to contemplate. And the other choice? I asked, my voice a whisper. The second man leaned forward slightly. For the first time, a flicker of something that might have been human emotion. A cold, clinical pity entered his eyes. The other choice, he said softly, is a long-term stay at a facility much like this one. For your own protection, of course. To ensure the cognito hazard remains contained. Permanently. It wasn't a choice. It was a life sentence, and they were letting me choose the shape of my prison. I signed the papers. I became a ghost. I spent the next 30 years living in the shadow of that secret. I moved from town to town, never staying anywhere too long. I never remarried. I couldn't. How could I build a life with someone when the foundation of my own identity was a lie? How could I explain the nightmares, the sudden irrational fear of deep water, the way I would sometimes find myself humming a low single note without realizing it? The secret was a cancer in my soul, slowly eating me from the inside out. I never saw my daughter again, except in old photographs. To her, her father was a hero who died at sea. It was a cleaner, kinder lie than the truth. The truth was that her father was a coward who took a deal to save his own skin, and who was now haunted by the sound of her crying, a phantom echo weaponized by a thing in the dark. Which brings me back to now. To this dusty basement, this old tape recorder, and the reason I'm finally breaking my oath. It's the silence. For 30 years, the government's silence has held. The story of the Pathfinder is just a footnote in naval history. Sturgeon's Rest is just another patch of empty water on the map. But a few months ago, I started seeing things. Small articles, buried deep in local papers from the Upper Peninsula. Reports of strange, localized magnetic fluctuations. Stories from fishermen about their compasses spinning wildly. A hiker who went missing near the pictured rock shoreline. And then, 2 weeks ago, a small, private seismological station run by a university in Michigan registered a single deep resonant pulse from the bottom of Lake Superior. The signature was identical to the EMP that had disabled our ship. The news report called it an unexplained geological event, but I knew better. The silence is fraying. The tomb is stirring. Whatever we did that day, whatever switch we flipped, it didn't stop it. Maybe we just angered it. Maybe we just reset a clock that has now, after 30 years, counted down to 0. I don't know what's coming, but I know that the official story is a lie, and the silence is a weapon being used against all of us. The world needs to know what is sleeping, what is waking, in the heart of the continent. They gave me a new name, a new life, and told me to forget. But I can't. Because sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world is asleep, I can still feel that deep, resonant hum in the bones of the earth. And I know it's still down there, and it remembers us. So, that's the story of Incident Sturgeon. A story that began with a hunt for Cold War ghosts and ended with the discovery of something far older and far more terrifying. It's a chilling reminder that the deepest parts of our world are still a mystery, and that some secrets are kept not to protect the public, but to protect a fragile reality from a truth it cannot handle. Officially, the USNS Pathfinder was lost to a storm. But you and I know the truth now. The storm wasn't in the sky. It was waiting in the water. Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story made you think, or look a little more nervously at the deep, dark water, support the channel with a like and subscribe, and be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, remember that the greatest mysteries aren't always in the distant stars. Sometimes, they're much closer to home, sleeping under the waves, waiting for a reason to wake up. And be careful what you go looking for in the dark. You might just find it.